Joining us now, Abigail Spanberger. She is the Democratic nominee for Congress in the 7th District of Virginia. That is the Richmond suburb. She'll be facing off with Dave Bratt. And this district now, a swing district. Abigail looked at by the Democrats as a very, very good candidate. She dispatched Dan Ward, who was a formidable candidate in and of himself, ex-Marine, dispatched him, crushed him by over 2-1. So she is the Democratic nominee, and she is joining us now. Just for a little historical context, the 7th District in Virginia, that if you go to 2017 in the Blue Wave, that district went for Ed Gillespie by 3 points. So very, very tight. So this thing could go either way, and she's joining us now. Abigail, thanks for being with us.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I appreciate you coming on. I always enjoy a good dialogue, and thanks for coming on. I couldn't get you on during the primary, but I turned the page, so now that's behind us. I'm a page turner, Abigail. I don't live in the past. I live in the future. Thanks for being with us. I want you to just introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us about your career in the CIA, what you did, and what led you to where you are now.
Sure. So my background is I'm originally from Henrico County, and I left for my career. I left after I went to college, and I began my career first in law enforcement. I was a federal agent with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, and I worked narcotics and money laundering cases with them, as well as dangerous mails. This is back in the anthrax scare times right after 9/11. So I was a HAZWOPER-trained responder during that time. And then from there, I went to the CIA. With the CIA, I was a case officer, also known as an operations officer, and I was working to collect the vital intelligence that would inform our policymakers, our presidents, our diplomats, and our military about top national security issues. And during my time with CIA, I worked an array of various different topics. I did work terrorism for the majority and the entirety of my time with the agency, as is common for so many CIA officers. But I also worked nuclear proliferation issues, Russia-focused issues, some narco-trafficking within Latin America. And really my focus was, I had two priorities: keeping our country safe from a potential terrorist threat and attack, and ensuring that we were making strong and informed decisions about issues of national security across the world. And I did that until 2014. And I was, at that point in time, I left CIA. I moved back to Central Virginia, and I started working in the private sector, and ultimately chose to run for office last year. We launched the campaign back in July.
Tell us about your family.
Yes. So I am a mother. I have a wonderful husband, and I have 3 daughters. I also have a very supportive extended family. Both my parents, both my sisters, and my husband's parents and his 2 brothers all live in Central Virginia, some of them in the 7th District and some of them in the 1st and the 4th District. So I'm incredibly lucky. The reason I left CIA was primarily to move my family back home, to be close to the people who are most impactful and most important in our lives, and so that's what we did. So we're incredibly lucky to have such a great support network here, particularly as I'm running for office.
Abigail, what was the biggest thing that you took away from your time in the CIA? Kind of the number one thing that keeps you up at night?
There are always more questions to be asked. There are always things that we need to prepare for as a country that we may not, and we have to keep asking questions constantly about threats, about information that we have. And for me, I mean, I spent so much time focused on terrorism that it is something that continues to stick with me. I think it is, it's our national security priority to work against the terrorist threat, and particularly once I removed myself from being a part of the intelligence community, it was a difficult shift. But I think overall, my biggest takeaway of the experience was the commitment to service. You know, the interesting thing about serving in that capacity is we dealt in facts as well as we could define them. We dealt in information as much as we could specify it. And our whole goal, regardless of who was president, and I worked under a Republican administration, I worked under Democratic administration, was to make sure that people had the information that they needed to make good and informed decisions. And so, in working with my colleagues, I don't know what their political leanings were, but we were focused on service to this country, and we were focused on protecting American people and, people we would never meet, people from our hometowns or people from places we would never even hear about. So for me, it was really a commitment to service, and I think that's one of the things that I find most troubling now about our political landscape is that it is so divided, and I think there are a lot of people who forget and who are distracted from this notion that we're all Americans. We all have similar goals and we all have similar priorities, and we should have a government that's committed to serving people, keeping people safe, and working to ensure the very future of this country and its citizens.
You're listening to the John Fredericks Radio Network, coming to you live from Washington, D.C., in our studios right by the Capitol. We're with Abigail Spanberger. She is the Democratic candidate for the 7th District in Congress in Virginia. She's taking on a two-term incumbent, Dr. Dave Bratt, in November. The winner of this race might very well determine who controls the House. Abigail, you mentioned the ongoing threat of terrorism. The Supreme Court yesterday upholding the president's 8-state travel ban, the president, of course, and the Supreme Court saying not religion, not Muslim. Really, these are 8 states with governments that are very lawless. They can't even trace what your passport is. It's not identified in the system. They don't have a good system of vetting, and they're known for exporting terror, and so they're banned. How do you stand on that, and why?
So I found the travel ban to be incredibly troubling, and so I don't support the Supreme Court's ruling, but I don't agree with it, I should say. And primarily it's because of my background in national security. And as I said, I view terrorism as an incredible ongoing threat to this country, and certainly one that I spent years devoted to working against and working to address. And so, but that perspective, my perspective in working against terrorism, in working to keep Americans safe, is exactly what informs my opinion that the travel ban was not the right method that we should, as a nation, pursue in attempting to address the terrorist threat. And certainly, if we want to look at how people receive visas to come here and who is coming here, then that is absolutely something that we do very well and we continue to do and should continue to do. But making a blanket prohibition on people from coming here, it really undermines our ability to work with partners. And some of the best partners that we have in the fight against terrorism come from majority Muslim countries. And so we need the support of those peers. Iraq was originally on. We need our vital relationship with the Iraqi services to work against the terrorist threat that continues to be present, both against the United States and against our partner nations across the country in Europe and throughout the Middle East. And so I don't think that in any way it was effective at keeping us safe, and in fact it undermined really truly important relationships that we have with other countries, and because of the president's own words where he was talking about it being a complete shutdown of Muslims entering the country, it isn't reflective of the values I believe that we should be putting forth as a country, and we should be dealing with the threats that we're facing in a very honest and assertive way. But that doesn't mean that, but we can do that while respecting our values and understanding the vital relationships that we have with partner nations across the world.
All right, Abigail, let's get into some real meat here on policy issues and what an Abigail Spanberger victory would mean in the House of Representatives. Let's get to immigration and start with the president's zero-tolerance policy. Now, look, we just heard a clip earlier from Mark Warner. Obviously, this was not executed properly. I think they were caught by surprise. They didn't have the planning. They're trying to fix it. So I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus is going forward. Do you believe in the zero-tolerance policy as a deterrent, Or would you rather go back to catch and release, which really isn't a policy at all? That just basically means you let anybody in for any reason, because that was the result of that plan. How do you stand on this?
Well, I think there is an important piece to what you originally said, which it wasn't a very good plan. And I think when we are implementing large policy that is not only impacting people's lives, impacting our international relations, but also costing us a tremendous amount of money, we need to plan. And as a CIA officer, anytime we would go out in the field, we had contingency plans for the 10 different things that could possibly happen. So I actually think it's problematic in and of itself that we had a failure to plan that was so enormous. And moving forward, had we continued with the zero tolerance policy, what would be the continued impact on families and frankly on our government's checkbook? I don't support the zero tolerance plan. It was in place for just a couple weeks, and it certainly wasn't showing to be a deterrent. There were horrific scenes of families being separated, of children being separated, and
right.
We said at the beginning of the show, I gave a background. I'm a mother. I have 3 children. But I don't think one needs to be a parent to recognize the incredible damage that we're doing to young lives by separating them from their parents.
We're short on time. I just want to get to what you want to do, right? I think we're all in agreement. The execution of this was not the president's best day. Let's put it that way. Going forward, though.
Yes.
Are you in favor of any immigration reform? Do you want to change chain migration? Do you want to go to a merit-based system like the president has suggested? Were you in favor of the Goodlett bill? What do you want to see happen?
So,
what's the Abigail policy?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What's the Abigail Spanberger immigration policy at the southern border?
I think when it comes to immigration, any lasting immigration reform that we're going to have has to be bipartisan, because there are too many constituencies, too many districts, too many diverse opinions that really need to come to the table. And if we are going to have significant reforms as it pertains to immigration, which I believe that we need, it has to be bipartisan in nature. And among the things that I would want to see in that bipartisan in those bipartisan shifts would be, one, we do need to prioritize our security at the border, but we also need to recognize what are the problems that we're trying to solve. Are we trying to address the number of people who are here without documentation, who are working across this country? In that case, we also need to ask ourselves the question, well, who are the employers who are hiring them, and is there a need for their labor? And so those become discussions about whether or not we should have additional visas available for either highly skilled or lower skilled workers who may be necessary to our economy. In terms of how we deal with people who are seeking asylum, I think that as a country we need to continue to recognize that there are people who are fleeing terrible situations and according to international law, have a right to seek asylum. And so treating those people in a way that's consistent with who we are as Americans, I think, is incredibly important. And that doesn't have to be, and it shouldn't be, to the detriment of our own security within this country. So looking at even the backlog that we have, there are year-long backlogs, multi-year-long backlogs of people going through our immigration process, and it becomes difficult for immigrants of every type and every background, whether they're coming here as graduate students and looking to continue on to work in a skilled, within our hospitals or within our technology fields or any other options, or whether or not they're filling a job at a factory. There are so many questions with how long it takes people to process through, and so many questions related to what is the certainty that can be afforded to people. So to kind of pull back to your original question, I think that really a discussion should be about everything related to how can we secure our borders and ensure that our security is first and foremost among the discussions, and certainly not something to be disregarded in the discussion. But then how can we also ensure that companies across this country have the employees that they want to hire? And then how can we also continue our culture of welcoming people from across the world? And when I've spent a lot of time overseas, and one of the most interesting things about this country is we've taken adventurers and explorers and people who are risk takers from across the world who are willing to cross leave their families and come here and make a new life. And when we look at the history of innovation and risk that we've had entrepreneurs take throughout our history, a lot of that is because of that kind of immigrant spirit that I do think is part of who we are.
Well, I don't think anybody's debating whether or not we should take immigrants in. We take 1 million in legally. I think the debate is, what do we do with those that come to the country illegally and break the law? And even when you get to the asylum seekers, we have 325 legal ports of entry to seek asylum. We have 85 of them along the southern border. We have 2 of them in San Diego. And I think what a lot of people feel is, if you're going to seek asylum, go by the U.S. law, do it the right way. But what's happened instead is they come over the border illegally. They try to elude authorities, right? They just try to get into the U.S. and disappear into the interior. They don't elude. They get apprehended. Then they throw up their hands and they say, I want asylum. They've already broken the law. I think that's one of the issues. But I want to get off this. Let's get to Trump's tax cut. Leaders in your party, Abigail Spanberger, are saying, hey, give us control of the House and we will repeal the Trump tax cut. Are you in favor of that or not?
Well, looking at this tax cut, and I in no way supported the tax cut because of the detriment that it causes our economy and American families. I'd like to first recognize that American families across this country, many of them did experience a bump in their paycheck because of this tax cut. So I recognize the benefit there. But the problem is that benefit is not outweighed by increasing healthcare premiums because of the loss of the individual mandate and the instability that was created within the marketplace because of the loss of the individual mandate. And the fact that American families may have small increases in their paychecks that are temporary, in this tax bill are temporary, to basically pay for permanent tax cuts for corporations, to me, I think is just misaligned with where our priorities should be. And the fact that we did that by adding, estimates are at this point, $2 trillion to our deficit and put ourselves on a trajectory where my kids and my grandkids will still be paying off this debt, and created an issue where now when we look at who holds our debt, it is an issue of national security. And again, with my background in CIA, I have grave concerns about the fact that, we look at the amount of debt that China holds, American debt that China holds, and looking towards the future, the Congressional Budget Office is predicting that our interest costs will be higher than all of our discretionary spending. And the idea that we're paying that much money in interest and our debt is held by foreign nations, I think, is something that should concern everyone. So circling back to your question about what to do about this tax cut, I'm not advocating for a full repeal or one set path forward, because honestly, I think it needs to be a discussion where people come to the table. But I do think this tax cut was a mistake. I recognize that some people in their paychecks do feel a little bit of a bump, but they also need to recognize that that's going to go away because those tax cuts were not permanent. And we had promises that the growth in the economy would offset the deficit that we've added, and in fact, those projections are not holding true.
Well, they can't. But Abigail, the tax cut doesn't really take effect, except for your W-4 withholding. The tax cut really doesn't take effect until people do their taxes in 2019 and take advantage of it. So you can't really judge it now. You have to wait until it gets into place. So yes or no? We can judge it now as well because we've already seen rising premiums for health care. But revenues are up, right? Right? They've been up consistently since this has gone down. So let me an up or down question. If you take control of the House and your party puts through a repeal of the Trump tax cut, will you vote to repeal it or not?
It depends on what the next step is.
Okay, that's fair.
That's fair.
That's fair.
And I know that's a yes or no question, but
that's fair.
If I'm someone who's campaigning on the notion that we should be making informed decisions, a simple repeal will not necessarily get us to a place where we're doing anything where we may not be addressing the concerns that led to the tax reform. I think we needed tax reform, but the bill that was put forth was not the right one. So a simple repeal, I don't think is necessarily, that shouldn't be the whole conversation.
All right, so you're going to wait and see, kind of like repeal and replace, right? Like Obamacare, what the Republicans are saying. You would repeal it depending on what the replacement is, all right? I think that's a fair answer. If your party takes control of the House and you win, are you going to vote for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker, Abigail Spanberger?
I am running because I believe that we need new leaders in Washington at all levels, from freshman members all the way up to leadership. And I think that the conversations that are happening in Washington are not effective at this point for moving this country forward. I think we need new leaders at all levels, because if we want to change the ineffective conversations, we need to change the people who are having them and change the people who are directing them.
So that means no, you wouldn't
Correct.
vote for Nancy, and you can't vote for Joe Crowley, so you're going to have to find something else. I was not a fan of his. Okay, a lot of people in your party saying, hey, and they're raising money off it. Democrats are saying, hey, elect us, give us the House back, and we will impeach Trump. Of course, there's no charges right now.
Yep.
What approach are you going to take with that?
So I believe that everyone is entitled to a fair judgment and due process when going through our court systems, and I think that particularly when we're looking at the president and whether or not to move forward with impeachment, it's incredibly important that I have any notion of what may or may not be presented. So to assert, if I were to arrive in Congress and be presented with impeachable offenses, then that would be a discussion. But I think it's really premature for anyone, Democrats or anyone else, to be talking about we must impeach until we recognize or have a full report from the Mueller report and recognize what is potentially what may or may not have happened that would signal or be judged as impeachable offenses.
Abigail Spanberger, Maxine Waters on Saturday at a rally basically on Democrats to rise up and bother or harass families of Homeland Security workers and people in the Department of Homeland Security, families of ICE, and of course we had the Sarah Sanders very unfortunate incident of being tossed out of the Red Hen in Lexington, by the way, home of VMI football. VMI starting September 1st. I am your voice of VMI football, so remember that. In Lexington, and when VMI plays Virginia, I'm not for your former alma mater there, obviously. So, having said that, do you think Maxine Waters is out of line? And then Cory Booker, who's running for president, he doubled down on it. I mean, what about this idea of public employees being harassed because you don't agree with the policy? What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's in some ways a complicated question, in some ways a simple question. You know, we have gotten to a point where people are not able to go home for Thanksgiving because politics has become such a toxic point of conversation. And I think that is detrimental to all of us. The fact that people can't, in a discussion in a restaurant, have a civil conversation about significant differences, I think that is a missed opportunity for us to connect as people and to try and find common ground. I also think that it's incredibly important that elected leaders advocate for positive changes, and I fully support people's right to give their positions and express incredible displeasure with the government and policies that the administration is taking, and certainly I've done that myself. But I think doing it in a way where your voice can be heard and accepted because it's not perhaps impeding on someone else's right or safety is most important. So overall, I think that it's become unfortunate that we find ourselves talking about how to exercise free speech and in what parameters we can, because getting in the faces of government employees, that's actually not how we affect real change to the policies that we disagree with. I agree with people's right to protest and people's rights to raise their voices against policies they think are unjust or wrong, and that's what makes us a truly wonderful country, is that freedom of speech. But I think using it in a way where it's most effective, and instead of missing opportunities to connect with other people and to have hard conversations, I think that's an unfortunate reality of some of the recent situations that we've seen.
Abigail, are you willing to debate your Republican opponent, Dave Brett?
I would love the opportunity to debate my Republican opponent, and I look forward to having ideally more than one opportunity to do so.
So we are thinking about organizing one. Would you be willing to look at some dates for that?
Absolutely.
All right. Abigail Spanberger, I really appreciate the time. We really hope to have you back so we can continue our dialogue. I think it's great for the listeners that we have and everybody in the 7th District, obviously, to be able to understand who you are and what some of your positions are. And I really appreciate your coming on today, and I appreciate your forthrightness and candor. Thank you. And so that everybody knows, there was no rules, like Spanberger campaign didn't send me questions or anything else. Abigail just came on and answered whatever I asked. That's the way the John Frederick Show rolls, and we appreciate that. Those that want questions written out and things of that nature, don't come on our show, because that's just not any fun and it's not interesting. So, Abigail, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well,
More information.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and with your listeners, and thank you so much for the opportunity. And I look forward to being back.
Please come back. And for more information on her campaign and for Abigail Spanberger, go to abigailspanberger.com. That's abigailspanberger.com. And then you can follow her on Twitter as well.